Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to try to paint this sunlit winter scene. I really enjoyed the last time I painted a winter landscape, so I wanted to paint another one. Like usual, I started out by masking the sides of my paper to secure it to my sketchbook. Then I'm going to roughly draw out the composition from this reference image that I found. I'll also link this image in the description box in case you need to see a bigger version. Once I'm done securing the page, I'm going to start by sketching out the rough composition. I'm not going to draw every single tree, but just the divisions like the pathway, horizon line, and the main trees like on the left and the right, because I tend to forget about leaving space for the foreground when I need to. And yes, they are going to be dark and you can paint on top of the background colors, but because I want to leave a little bit of light area for the side of the tree when the light hits, I need to leave the trees as just white off the page so I can control the value of those light areas later. So I'm pretty much done with the outline. I made sure to clean the lines as well as I can. And next, here are the colors that I'll be using for the painting. Firstly, this is Crimson Lake by Holbein, followed with Aquarius Green by Szmal, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Szmal, Burnt Umber by Holbein, and lastly, Indigo by Schmincke. I'm going to divide the painting into two halves, which is the sky or the background and middle ground and foreground together. So I'm going to start with the middle ground and foreground by just wetting the surface so I can work with the wet on wet technique. I'm going to begin by mixing a little bit of yellow ochre into indigo, and I'm going to use a really light consistency to paint the snow and the pathway. I'm just leveling out the snow, so I'm making horizontal lines a bit closer together at the back and a bit further apart when it's closer to the foreground, and this will just give a sense of depth and also the distance of the pathway. I'm also going to paint the snow at the back near the horizon line, but for the middle of that horizon line, I used tissue to take off the color, so I spared that area for the light to reflect on the snow and to travel to the foreground. Next, I'm going to mix up a warm yellow by using Hansa Yellow and a tiny bit of Crimson Lake, and I'm just going to place this on top of the snow on the pathway that I painted earlier, and this will just give a little bit of a base color glow to those areas. And after that, I'm going to work on the snow on the right and left of the path, but because I've worked on the path for a while, those areas are dry now already, so I'm just going to re-wet it with clean water. Once it's wet, I'm only going to put on a very light consistency of the indigo mix, and I'm just placing them randomly. This is because parts of those vegetation has to be quite bright yellow-green or maybe even a warm yellow from the sunlight, so I don't want to place too much indigo as the base color because it might distract or muddy the lighter colors on top. Now I'm going to be working on the vegetation. I'm going to first map out those light areas so I know where to avoid when painting the darker tones. And for that I used a bit of Crimson Lake and Aquarius Green with a lot of Hansa Yellow in the mix. I can see the very light area on the reference image a little bit further back from the tree, and I'm going to remind myself to leave that area light. And at this point I also felt like the yellow-green wasn't warm enough, so I also dot a little bit of that orangey mix from earlier, so there's a slight variation to the yellow-green. After that, I'm just going to scatter them around the back as well near the light source and a little bit at the front. This does not have to be accurate, and if the yellow covers more than you intend to, it's completely fine because you can always cover it up with the darker tones, but not the other way around. While the surface is still wet, I'm going to continue on with the light green mix with added Aquarius green, and I'm just going to let the green mingle with the warm yellows. I'm just dotting them around while leaving a little bit of negative space so it doesn't look too dense, and there's a bit of space where the snow is peeking through the vegetation. While doing this, you don't have to stick to just the same mixture, and you can add more yellow or orange if you feel like you've left out certain areas. And for the light vegetation on the right hand side, I used a lighter consistency green so it doesn't cover too much of the snow. Now I'm going to work on the darker tones while the paint is still wet. I'm just using Aquarius green as is, and I'm taking the basic idea of the reference image and try to place the darker spots roughly around the vegetation. Here I try to separate the plane of the lighter vegetation and the darker area at the back. So here I try to create cleaner edges to do that by waiting for that area to be a bit more dry. As for the darker tone of green, I like to add a little bit of indigo to the Aquarius green and a thicker consistency so I can keep building on those darker areas. I also switched to my smaller brush here because I felt like the space is getting smaller than before, so I don't need to cover as much surface and I can work on a bit more detail at the stage of the painting. As the surface is starting to dry, the paint will travel less, so I can start adding more detail on the grass. The grass on the reference image is fairly short, but I want to make mine a bit taller, and this is completely up to you, but I'm just going to add more of the grass texture now instead of just painting blobs like earlier. Just like the snow on the pathway, the grass closest to the foreground is bigger and taller since it's closer to us, and I made them further and shorter as I get further back in the composition. For the grass at the back, it's a bit hard to paint short, tiny ones, so I use dry brush texture instead to depict the grassy area. And as for the color, I like to play with the value as well as the tones of greens by switching up the ratio. As long as I place the correct value, I can play with the tonality and the hues a bit more. Here I'm just cleaning out the edges of the grassy area near the tree trunk, and then I'm going to move on to the background of the composition by wetting the surface just like before. I'm going to wet the whole area, even the tree trunks, and after that the first thing I want to map out is the light source. For the light, I use a very light consistency of Hansa yellow, and I want to make a big oval and then soften the edges to create a soft glow. I want the middle to be fairly white, so I'm going to stop the paint from traveling to the middle by using tissue to take off the excess paint or moisture. Then with the orange mix of Crimson Lake and Hansa Yellow, I'm going to build up the warmth of the painting by adding it to the outer area of the light yellow and then spreading it out. I'm spreading it out to the sides just like the reference, then I'm going to add more Hansa Yellow in a medium consistency to add the vibrancy of the glow around the oval. While the surface is still wet, I'm going to dot the leaves on the trees so it would blur out with the background. For the color, I used a mix of Hansa Yellow with Burnt Umber and Aquarius Green to make the green a bit more muted and warmer, and I'm just going to place them roughly as how I see the reference. As I get closer to the center or the light source, I would use less green in the mix, so the color of the leaf should be more yellow and a bit more green as it gets to the right or the left hand side. And by doing this, it should enhance the glowing effect. Next, I'm going to paint the tree trunks, and for that I used a mixture of Indigo, Crimson Lake, and Burnt Umber to create a brown. I wasn't sure what tone of brown I wanted, so I just played around with the ratio, and I also add Aquarius green when I want to try using more of a muted brown. Personally, I don't mind the variation in the browns, but if you want them to be a bit more cohesive than what I'm painting here, you can always swatch the colors on scrap paper first and try to find the tone that you want to incorporate in your painting. I'm painting this on a slightly damp surface so the edges blur out a little bit, and when the tree stems touches the light in the middle of the oval, I made the tree trunks thinner as if parts of it is blown out by the bright light. I also made the trees look a bit crooked and diagonal because I wasn't paying enough attention. It wasn't exactly intentional. Personally, I think it'll look nicer when they're fairly straight and uniform, but in different values and thickness. So just keep that in mind when you're creating your own version of this painting. Also keep in mind that the value of the tree trunk should look much lighter when they're at a distance and darker with a bit more detail if they're in the foreground, which is why I'm still leaving the main trees in front. Here I added more leaves with a warm green mix, and I'm just doing this on top of the blurred leaves to make it look a bit more dense. Just like before, as I get closer to the light source, I made the leaves look a bit more golden brown to suit the glow of the light. I'm going to do the same with the bushes. I decided to make it a bit more dense by layering it on, and I'm also adding a bit more detail by using a dry brush texture in a light to medium consistency. And the same thing applies just like before. As I get closer to the light source, I made the color a bit more golden brown by adding a bit more Hansa yellow or yellow ochre in the mix, and as it's further away, it's a bit more green. I decided to darken this tree trunk here because I realized that I've placed it closer to the front. So I want to start varying the values a bit more after mapping out where I want to place the tree trunks. Here I'm going to add more of the tree trunks which are further away, and I use my liner brush for this so I can create finer lines. Next, I want to work on the trees which are in the foreground. For this, I started out by using a golden brown mix from whatever brown that was on my palette with added Hansa yellow and crimson lake. to add a bit of an orange tone, and I'm just painting one side of those tree trunks to give a bit of that glow from the light. And then I'm going to follow this up with the consistency of a dark brown mix by using burnt umber with indigo. I'm using a dry brush load so I can create textures for the dark part of the tree, and this will suggest detail without having to actually paint on actual details separately. Now that I've pretty much covered the whole frame with the elements that I want to include, I'm going to build on the additional textures and details with more dry brush textures. I'm starting with the back by adding golden brown on top of the vegetation, and I'm just going to jump around to build value and detail to balance out the whole composition. Most of the area of the vegetation is covered by green, so I'm just going to enhance the glow of the backlight further by using a mix of yellow ochre with a bit of Aquarius green to create a golden yellow-brown color. And I'm just going to adjust the ratio according to how yellow or how green I want the color to be. Since I've been working more on the background, the foreground now needs a bit more attention for added detail, and I'm going to work on the vegetation at the front. I'm going to build on the detail by adding darker values. I mix indigo with a green to create a darker green and use a dry brush to add that detail just like what I did before at the back. And I'm also going to enhance the areas which is reflected with light a bit more. At this point, I'm just using the reference image to look at little details that I might want to include in my painting. After I'm fine with the value and density of the vegetation, I'm just going to tap my brush horizontally with a dry brush consistency around the edges of the vegetation, and this will just suggest shorter vegetation covered with snow, and I feel like this also gives a better transition from the snow pathway to the dense vegetation. Next, I switched to my size 0 brush to add finer details with really delicate lines. I added longer grass textures to get a different height and texture of the vegetation for added interest. Finally, I'm going to work on the pathway by just adding very light consistency yellow to add the glow, and I'm also going to use indigo with a touch of yellow ochre to create a bit of the shadow on the snow. As the last final detail, I'm going to add very fine grass textures scattered on the snow, and I'm also going to paint some around the edges of the pathway to create the transition like I mentioned earlier. And once I'm done, I'm just going to unmask the painting and give it one final look. I felt like cleaning some of the lines for the tree stem, and after that, that's basically the completed painting. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be listed in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!